Now, Teals on the crossbench in the House of Representatives don't often split, but they did this week when Sophie Scamps and Kylie Tink from Sydney's North Shore voted with the Greens on a Middle East motion that took a hard line against Palestinians in particular. From Melbourne, a Kooyong independent, Monique Ryan, didn't take that position. She joined us here before question time. Monique Ryan, welcome back to the program. Of course, in international relations, wording needs to be precise and nuanced. I suppose you've witnessed that this week in debate on the Middle East crisis, particularly in the House. Do you agree, just on today's developments, with Cabinet Minister Ed Husic that, quote, Palestinians are being collectively punished here for Hamas?
Here as in Australia or here as in Israel?
Yeah. Well, I think both actually was the inference of his statement.
Well, I think certainly, Greg, we know that Hamas, which is a terrorist organisation, reflects only a very, very small part of the Palestinian population. But all of the people of Palestine are now being subjected to the response from Israel to the Hamas attacks of the 7th of October. And in that respect, yes, they are being subjected to a punishment that they do not deserve, and I think I have great compassion for them. What I've hoped to and tried to communicate to my own community is that that shouldn't in any way be reflected in a change in the way that we respond to Muslim members of Australia, Australian society, and I would really hope that that wouldn't be the case, and that the relatives or families of Palestinian families in Australia wouldn't be subjected to any sort of social change in their social relations with their peers, their colleagues, their friends as a result of what's going on in the Middle East.
These things don't have to be binary, but all too often they seem to become so. It doesn't sound, Monique, as though you are of the view that Australia's formal position articulated by the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister is tilted too much towards Israel's right to defend itself. Is that correct?
There's absolutely no doubt that Israel had a right to defend itself to the reprehensible and abhorrent attacks by the Hamas terrorists on the 7th of October. What we do need, and I agree with the government on this, is a nuanced approach. We need to understand the complexities of the situation, but we do need for Israel to follow international humanitarian law and to protect civilians as much as is possible in this conflict.
You voted for the multi-point motion in the House, essentially the government's, but it was attracting bipartisan support, and against the Greens amendment, which differentiated itself by seeking to condemn war crimes perpetrated by the State of Israel. Why did you adopt that position?
Well, it was fairly simple, really. The first point of the Greens motion removed the mention of the fact that Hamas's attack on Israel was abhorrent and that it was an act of terrorism, and I had a problem with that because I had absolutely no issue with the statement that the government had put up in that respect.
Did the Greens motion not also remove that the Parliament stands with Israel and recognises its inherent right to defend itself?
That statement was in the government's motion, so I had no problem with supporting the government's motion. You know, that was something with which I certainly agree, totally agree. But the main thing was the need for the government, with which I was completely concurrent, that we had to absolutely and without any doubt put on record the fact that Australians were disgusted by Hamas's actions in Israel on the 7th of October.
Yeah, I don't want to spend too much time dwelling on commentary on the Greens, but you're probably aware that the Jewish community, particularly in Sydney, via its leadership, has been scathing of the Greens. The Australian Greens have acted utterly shamefully in the way they've conducted themselves, standing on the side of terror, they say, rather than the victims of it. Do you extend that criticism to the Greens in the Parliament this week?
It's a really difficult time, Greg, and I think it's a time where all of us need to try and find balance and nuance. And I've spoken with many members of my own community in Kooyong, Jewish and other, who have expressed extreme distress at what's been going on in Israel and in Gaza. And I concur with those and I'm supportive of those. And I think really extreme statements that are non-biased, if you like, which take sides in this, are not helpful to anyone. They're not helpful only for international relations, but they're also not helpful in what we need to do in our own communities, which is to build social cohesion.
Have you witnessed such statements in the chambers or in this building this week?
I think there have been people in the chamber who have been attempting to politicise this situation for their own domestic political ends, and I think that's shameful, and I won't be supportive of it, and I will continue to push back against the opposition and the Greens when they try to do that.
You think both are guilty of that? We've discussed the Greens. Just explain the opposition's conduct.
I think the opposition is trying to make political points out of this. I don't think that the opposition has been supportive enough of Palestinian members of the Australian community or Muslim members of the Australian community. I think the opposition is trying to play wedge politics in a way that is Peter Dutton's go-to, and I don't think it's helpful for us either in terms of our international relations, as we heard from Mike Burgess this week, but also in terms of the domestic situation.
We'll seek responses because we are talking to Liberal MPs in the program today. But since you mentioned Mike Burgess, what's your own assessment of the risks of social unrest being fomented, if not now, then through the further deterioration of what happens in the Middle East?
I think we all have to be careful as politicians. We have to be responsible and sensitive in how we behave. I met with the Foreign Minister and the Minister for Home Affairs about this morning, and we talked about the importance of supporting our communities and in supporting compassionate and generous treatment of all Australians. And the language that we use does matter, and we need to be responsible and thoughtful about that in this place.
Are they giving you practical advice on what to say or do about planned protests or other activities in your electorate?
Not specifically, no. But what they have done and what we have all talked about is the need to support our communities, and that's something that I certainly intend to do.
All right. Very sharply changing tack, Monique Ryan. The Prime Minister's going to Washington next week, where we presume he will address the matter of Julian Assange, just as you did in the US Capitol. What realistically do you expect that he could say that would make a difference?
Well, I hope that he will convey what we in the parliamentary delegation conveyed to the parliamentarians that we, the Congress people, that we met in Washington some weeks ago, which was that 9 out of 10 Australians believe that it's time for Julian Assange to be released and brought home. But the other thing we talked to the Congress people that we met about was the fact that Australians really believe strongly, as Americans do in their First Amendment, in the right of free press and the importance of freedom of the media to report on matters of public interest. And I think that's a message that the Prime Minister will be conveying to President Biden and to Congress
ultimately,
next week.
Where does the resolution lie there in your view? Is it through plea bargaining, somewhat detached and removed from political leadership, or through executive calls by politicians?
Look, I think I can't speak to Mr Assange and for his right or decisions he might make in terms of any charges that might be preferred against him or his legal proceedings. But I do think it's very, very important that the American government, with which we have a really close relationship, understands the extent to which this issue matters to Australians, and the fact that neither side really wants this to become an increasing thorn or matter of dissension between us.
Yeah, well, we'll ask the Prime Minister and others about that when they're in Washington. Monique Ryan, always good to chat. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Greg.